Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study of the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. Currently we in 1 Samuel chapter 24. Now, what's interesting about this portion as we close, we're steaming towards the end of 1 Samuel. Remember, probably in the original writings, 1st and 2nd Samuel was one book. And basically it tells the story of the first two kings. We are now talking, of course, about Saul. Saul has been rejected by God. And God has pronounced judgment on Saul. And so we're going to see the tragic end of Saul. Now we also are going to see where David, even though he is anointed king, but it's been like 13 years since this anointing, this choosing. You also got to remember during these days that as we are focused, the Bible is focused on certain stories. Sometimes those stories appear, or they look like that, the appearance of God, these experiences with God happen every day in their life, and they didn't. Sometimes there were long stretches of periods of time. And also when it says that, God spoke to them, sometimes that those messages could have came through signs and different other things, and not only the prophet. I'm not saying all of that because David is, we're going to see him really go through some despair when it feels like, man, everything is against him, despite that God has told him he was going to be king. Later on, we're going to see where he's going to sink so into despair, he even would join the ranks of the Philistines. It's unbelievable. And one of the, I think the greatest things for that is that despite that, God preserves him. And one of the greatest takeaways for us is, yes, you can mess up. Yes, you're flawed and certainly imperfect. But God is bigger than that. See, God is bigger than our mess ups. And so we will see him spare David. We will see him can keep David. And now as we even go into 1 Samuel 24, remember, Saul almost had David. In other words, he almost had him cornered, but then all of a sudden the Philistines kind of attack, and Saul had to go and break off his pursuit of David, which in and of itself is just kind of amazing, because you have to stop and think about the men. And Samuel, remember, told Israelites that your kings would do this. You would be subject to the whims. I'm paraphrasing, but you would be subject to the whims of your king. And here they are, going through the hillside looking for David, to kill David, whom Saul acknowledges God's choice. Samuel the prophet acknowledged it. The men knew it, and yet they have to follow David. Now remember, we also saw this horrific response of Saul to kill Ahimelech, the priest Ahimelech, because he gave aid to David. So they're seeing this. The people are seeing this. Okay. All right. 1 Samuel chapter 1 Samuel chapter 1. I mean, First Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. What the heck? All right, let's move you down here. Okay, it says, when Samuel returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the wilderness near Engedi. Now, remember, Saul is deteriorating spiritually, mentally, emotionally. He's been, not only has God rejected Saul, but he's tormenting Saul. Now, in that, and I'm going to say as a sidebar, this is just a thought, and this is just my thought, my opinion. If you wanted to kind of get how hell would be, partially, the torment of hell, this is it, that Saul cannot even enjoy his luxury, enjoy his opulence, his fame, his position. He's tormented, and that's the tragic thing about Saul. Okay. Verse 2, so Saul took 3,000 of Israel's choice men and went to look for David and his men in front of the rocks of the wild goats. When Saul came to the sheep pens along the road, a cave was there, and he went in to relieve himself. And David and his men were staying in back of the cave. Now, David was, you gotta get the picture of what's going on here. David, by the way, a cave, you might think, well, why didn't Saul see him? Because caves are dark. Now, I've never been in a cave. I'm told that there's a cave somewhere in America. I want to say somewhere around Arizona, but where you could go into, when you get into the cave, that the tour guide will cut the lights, and it is so dark you cannot see in front of you. Okay, so these, in other words, so caves are caves. So caves are dark. That's why they didn't see David and them in the back. And then all of a sudden, here is Saul, and they're relieving himself. Probably a number 2. In other words, he just didn't go in because number 1, he probably would have done it outside, but number 2, he's in there. Now, verse 4. What is also interesting is that you would almost have to think modern day Secret Service should have went in and inspected the cave, but they didn't. And we're going to see a lot of failures of Saul's security team, okay, which David is going to point out, by the way. So verse 4, so they said to him, David's men, look, this is the day the Lord told you about. I will hand your enemies over to you so that you can do to him whatever you desire. Then David got up and secretly cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Now remember, Saul is probably stooped over, relieving himself. And David secretly cuts just the corner of his robe. Just the corner of his robe. Now, you also want to be careful about people when they tell you things. You want to be careful when people are telling you the Lord is this and the Lord is that. Verse 5, afterwards, now this is amazing, afterwards David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. And he said to his men, I swear before the Lord I will never do such a thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. I will never lift my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. Now, this is why David will become known as the greatest king. He had the heart of God right here. The heart of God. We would applaud him for that. We would hold him, we would say, David, you are blameless in this. But notice David's concern. This is God's anointed. I will not touch God's anointed. And even though he's evil, And even though he's doing wrong, I will not touch God's anointed. And right there shows us David's heart for God. Verse 7. With these words, David persuaded his men, and he did not let them rise up against Saul. Then Saul left the cave and went on his way. So let me be gross here. He wiped himself, tossed it, and went on his way. Verse 8. After that, David got up and went out of the cave and called to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed to the ground in homage. David said to him, David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of people who say, 'Look, David intends to harm you'? You can see with your own eyes that the Lord handed you over to me today in the cave. Someone advised me to kill you, but I took pity on you and said, I won't lift up my hand against my Lord, since he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at the corner of your robe in my hand, for I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. And the Lord recognized that there is no evil or rebellion in me. I haven't sinned against you, even though you're hunting me down to take my life." It says, "May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord take vengeance on you for me, but my hand will never be against you. As the old proverb says, wickedness comes from wicked people. My hand will never be against you. Who has the king of Israel come after? What are you chasing after? A dog, a dead dog, a flea. May the Lord may the Lord be the judge and decide between you and me. May he take notice and plead my case and deliver me from you." Now, this Proverbs we don't have, I don't think. He doesn't cite the book where it comes from. And certainly not Solomon, since Solomon is not born. But I want you to understand that his heart, and this is something, again, what I'll take away from this. Notice his heart, David's heart, is always, when we talk about godliness, it is a Godward attitude. It is an attitude that is always towards God. And the difference between people today, sinners, the ungodly, is that they have a me attitude, selfish attitude, okay, and not a Godward attitude. If I was to give you a advice, some of you singles who are looking for spouses, on what basis do you choose? Now you could choose based upon, I'm actually jumping ahead because the next chapter I'm going to really get into this, but I'll say it now. If you choose between outward appearance instead of inward appearance, godliness, that will always preserve you. What kind of heart do they have? Now, verse 16, when David finished saying these things to him, Saul replied, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" Then Saul wept aloud and said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have done what is good to me, though I have done what is evil for you." Now, Saul is having a moment, and I do say a moment of clarity. Verse 18, "You yourself have told me today what good you did for me, when the Lord handed you over to me, but you didn't kill me. When a man finds his enemies, does he let him go unharmed? May the Lord repay you with good for what you've done for me today." Now, this is, again, Saul. Okay, understand that this is Saul having a moment of clarity. This is not his whole heart. And as we will see, he will constantly go back and forth on this. But notice the next verse here, and notice the acknowledgement. He says, "Now I know for certain you will be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. The question is, he's acknowledging this in front of all of his men, and yet we will see again where he will hunt David down. Verse 20 again, now I know for certain you will be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. I can't help but say this on a side note. I'm thinking about a former president whom could fit Saul. All right. I'm not going to, I digress. Okay, verse 21. Therefore swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's house. So David swore to Saul. Then Saul went back home, and David and his men went up to the stronghold. Now remember, the strongholds is really the wilderness. Okay, the wilderness. It's just a kind of euphemism. It is, they're going to wander around these kind of wilderness, forests, things like that. Notice Saul says, "Don't swear to me that you will not wipe out my name." And again, Saul, David is not your problem. God is. So God is the one who's going to wipe out his line. Now we'll see this later, but remember I said that the outcome of this, Jonathan, will be one of the saddest tales of this story. Collateral damage. He will, I think, pay in a sense for his father's name. We'll get to that later, but it's not David. David swore, and David will remain true to that, but it will be God who will, again, as he has said, eliminate Saul's lineage. Okay, he's going to eliminate Saul's lineage. Now, David, again, doesn't go back to the service of Saul. And from here on out, he won't. As I said, this is a moment of clarity that Saul has. It will soon vanish, as he will soon hunt David again. And again, in God's timing, however, while God is working his timing, David is going to, kind of suffer some more persecution, things like that. But we'll get into that in the next chapter. I will see you guys in chapter 25. Gonna be a wonderful story, by the way. Chapter 25. All right. See you next time.